realized that this sermon series on Proverbs is not only about the book of Proverbs, but is also about things that Jeff knows nothing about. So we spent the first week discussing wisdom. Last week we discussed parenting. And this week, well, why not complete the circle of Pastor Jeff's ignorance as we discuss the topic of women. And to be honest, the first thing that came to mind when I thought about the topic of women was this 1990s cult film called So I Married an Axe Murderer. Have anyone else seen this movie? It's Michael Myers as a beat poet singing his poem about women. Woman! Whoa, man! Whoa, man! If I had a jazz group behind me, I could continue on. I was raised in a house mostly with two brothers and a dad who raised us to play sports, enjoy the outdoors, and eat all sorts of unhealthy food. My friends were guys. The people I looked up to as a child were other male athletes, and musicians, and eventually writers. In short, to borrow from the singer James Brown, the song in the back of my head playing was, "It's a Man's World." By the way, it's co-written by his girlfriend at the time, Betty Jean Newsom. Now, long story short, I did eventually learn to appreciate women. I've come to meet some amazing women in my life, my mom being the first. My wife, Julie, is teaching and reminding me every day that it is no longer a man's world for this newly married man. What I've come to appreciate about some women in particular is how they can share with me a perspective that is not that many men have. In particular, there have been some female theologians and writers that have challenged my way and perhaps the entire church's way of seeing the world in some life-giving ways. For example, there is a writer who I have come to know and love. Her name is Barbara Brown Taylor. In one of her recent books called An Altar in the World, A Geography of Faith, she shares these views on how she continues to evolve in her faith life. She writes, "What is saving my life now is the conviction that there is no spiritual treasure to be found apart from the bodily experiences of human life on earth. My life depends on engaging the most ordinary physical activities with the most exquisite attention I can give them. My life depends on ignoring all touted distinctions between the secular and the sacred, the physical and the spiritual, the body and the soul. What is saving my life now is becoming more fully human, trusting that there is no way to God apart from real life in the real world." Again, that's Barbara Brown Taylor. And Taylor shares with us an understanding of the sacred that goes beyond scripture and ritual into the everydayness of life. Faithful living occurs just as much in the mundane of our lives as it does in the extraordinary. However, despite the many gifts that women share with the world, many men have trouble with women who may be considered equal or even more powerful. What is it about an empowered woman that makes some men fearful and other men enraged? Why are some women's movements in other parts of the world, like the effort for women to drive or to go to school, met with such hostility? Why are women leading in government considered dangerous? Why are movements like the #MeToo movement here in the U.S. met with jokes and slurs vitriol. Ever think about why God has historically been referred to with male qualities? Or why most of the characters and authors in the Bible are men? Or why having a female pastor is a relatively new phenomenon in the history of the church? I would like to take all of these experiences, all of these stories and all of these questions, and meditate upon them in this final chapter from the book of Proverbs, again, chapter 31, verses 10 through 21. What can we learn from this text about women, about God, and perhaps about ourselves? The reading begins with what some editors will call an ode to a capable wife. The author celebrates a woman who is precious, trustworthy, and a hard worker. It begins with verse 10, a capable wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts her, that he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. And then the next section of this text discusses the day-to-day living of the wife. And what I love about this is how, as the author is able to connect the faithfulness of the woman with the daily activities, just like Barbara Brown Taylor was writing about. Verse 13, she seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it's still night and provides food for her household and tasks for her servant girls. And then the following verses 16 through 22, they discuss how some wonderful attributes of this woman. She's thoughtful, strong, hardworking, compassionate, giving, fearless. Verse 16, she considers a field and buys it. With fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out to her hands to the needy. She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all her household are clothed in crimson. And today's reading closes by sharing just how beloved she is within the city, within her family, and certainly by her God. Verse 25, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy, her husband too, and he praises her, saying, many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. What a fantastic selection of text to discover here within the book of Proverbs. And while yes, much of the Bible does seem to refer to the man's world of old, there are also some wonderful stories and characters and spiritual teachings that allow us to appreciate the ongoing faithfulness of women in the larger narrative of our relationship with our Creator. Time and time again, it is a woman who shows up to shed new light or a new perspective on the world. It was Esther who spoke up to save her people from genocide. It was this unnamed woman on the street who challenged Jesus' own perspectives of God's compassion for those outside the Jewish tradition. It was Mary who shared the good news of Christ's resurrection. The list goes on and on again, from Sarah to Rebecca, on throughout Ruth and Esther, all the way throughout Lydia and Mary and beyond. Time and time again, women have been there to bring their God-given gifts and attributes to glorify God and to allow us to experience God's love in new ways. And God's prophetic word from the words and lives of women is certainly not done. Nadia Bolz-Weber is an author who writes about God's love in some amazing ways today. And so I want you to listen for how she brings her unique self to describe God's grace, and it's also found inside of your bulletins here as well. She writes this in a book called Pastrix, The Cranky, Beautiful Faith of a Sinner and Saint. She says, God's grace is a gift that is freely given to us. We don't earn a thing when it comes to God's love, and we only try to live in response to that gift. No one is climbing the spiritual ladder. We don't continually improve until we are so spiritually that we no longer need God. We die and are made new. But that's different from spiritual self-improvement. We are simultaneously sinner and saint. 100% of both, all of the time. The movement in our relationship to God is always from God to us. Always. We can't, through our own piety or goodness, move closer to God. God is always coming near to us. Today we celebrate the good news that God calls all people, and especially the unique perspectives of women, to share God's love and grace with the world. We are called to bring all that we have, all that we are, our daily, ordinary lives, to place it at the feet of our Creator and to share with the world what God does to make us whole and holy, time and time again. Today we gather around Christ's table, and as Bolt Weber writes, we celebrate God coming near to us. We celebrate that, as the author of Proverbs writes, God comes to us in the ordinariness of daily living, in bread and cup, and is nothing short of melding our hearts with grace and love. And today, friends, we celebrate all women and men who continually remind us how God continues to show us new thinking, new perspective, new life, each and every day. And all of God's children say, Amen.